Your host today is Jim Safransky, Senior Vice President of Customer Platform Services at FiberLink. I would now like to turn the conference over to Mr. Safransky.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And today we have a special edition of our highly attended More webinar series. As you all probably know, based on your invitation to join us, we have the pleasure of having Ben Gray of Forrester Research lead a discussion today about building an effective mobile device strategy. We thought this would be of great value to you based on our experience with our customers using Mass 360 for mobile device management. What we've seen is there's both a rush to put in place management solutions for iOS and Android devices and others, and a need to rethink, in many cases from scratch, an overall strategy for mobile. And while there's lots of reasons for this mobile onslaught, as I call it, one primary reason is what we call the empowered consumer. And while this graphic is quite simple, right, users using devices and apps to access and manipulate email and data, just about everything has changed for a business and for most everyone who's probably on this webinar, from what devices and who buys them to how apps are built and delivered to types of data being used, even like geo-contextual data. So over the years, I've consulted frequently with Ben Gray of Forrester to make sure we're building solutions that are leading the market and fit IT's current needs, and we always walk away having learned something important for us. So with that, we've invited Ben Gray, whose official title is Principal Analyst, overseeing what I understand to be most everything to do with business class, end user, and mobile computing, to share some of his insights with you today. So with that, welcome, Ben.
Okay, Jim, thanks so much for that kind introduction. So good afternoon, everyone. As Jim mentioned, this is Ben Gray. I'm a principal analyst within Forrester Research. Forrester Research is an independent technology research company, headquartered also here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I got to tell you, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here on FiberLink and Mass 360's behalf to present on a fundamentally hot topic, and that is building an effective mobile device management strategy. So I mentioned, and Jim sort of teed up, that this is a hot area. I mean, that's really understated. Fundamentally, we're seeing most enterprise IT managers now revisiting their entire mobile strategy in this empowered age, where gone are the days where employees are largely confined to a single platform, and more often than not, that was BlackBerry or perhaps Windows Mobile or perhaps Symbian. But they're being highly influenced by this dawn of consumerization, where by the very nature of things, employees are consumers. They are being highly influenced by the technology that they're using at home. They're coming into their work environments and they're expecting a comparative, if not superior, mobile computing strategy. And so we're seeing a lot of IT departments now reevaluating their broader enterprise mobility strategy, looking to revisit what mobile management and security policies they're looking to control on not just the IT-owned assets, but increasingly even personally owned assets. And we're seeing a lot of organizations now prioritizing their investment in an effective mobile device management strategy and a robust mobile device management solution that really fits all of their requirements. So as Jim sort of teed up, to quickly introduce myself, so I'm a principal analyst within our infrastructure and operations team. Over the last 7 years within Forrester, I've devoted a ton of research and attention to enterprise mobility strategy, looking at things like mobile device hardware, mobile OSs, and the various platform wars that we now find ourselves in, as well as mobile device management and mobile security. So we're actually covering quite a full agenda today in a relatively brief period of time. So over the course of the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be touching on the state of commercial mobility, and I'll be sure to highlight actually some data that Forrester's captured as we survey 3,000 IT decision makers and mobility decision makers annually, and we ask them a lot of interesting questions with regard to how widely deployed mobile devices are, smartphones, slates, and tablets, which of the various platforms that they officially support or have plans to support, which mobile applications they're developing for their, information workers and mobile workers, Also be touching upon consumerization's impact on mobile strategy. So whether organizations support individually liable or personally on mobile devices, and if they do, what does support actually mean, and how do they provide that support to their empowered employees? I'll touch upon how firms are rethinking their broader mobile policies. So certainly technology is a critical component, but we're seeing a lot of IT managers also revisiting how they segment their workforce. So they're focusing on the people resources, the people that they support, and also the internal people resources they have to provide support to their increasingly mobile, decentralized, and distributed workforces. And then finally, I'll touch upon some of the mobile device management and security best practices that Forrester, as a research company, has exhaustively teased out of our clients through research interviews. So without any further ado, let's just dive right into it. So building an effective mobile device management strategy is really critical, and it's not just really critical over time, it's really critical today. And the reason that it's really critical today is that we're seeing these 4 empowering technologies converging. Technologies around cloud computing services. So we're seeing organizations obviously embracing web applications, they're embracing cloud-hosted services, and mobile device management is yet another IT service that internal IT managers provide to their employees, but now there's cloud-hosted mobility platforms that are coming up, and Mass 360 is a great example of that. And we're seeing a lot of IT shops now actually prioritizing their investment in mobility as a service. We're also seeing pervasive video bleeding into the enterprise space and having a really profound impact on how employees are trained and how employees collaborate with their peers and their colleagues and their suppliers and partners and executive managers. We're seeing social technology also having a profound impact, so web applications, LinkedIn and all the social media applications that are bleeding into the enterprise space, really whether IT shops have formal policies around or not. And then of course smart mobile devices. What do I mean by smart mobile devices? Well, all of these converging technologies, these empowering technologies are converging on smartphones, on slates, on tablets, and even PCs. So we're seeing a lot of organizations now fundamentally rethinking their entire enterprise mobility strategy, which is, a pretty transformative experience. And they're realizing that, in a perfect world, they wouldn't have to invest in yet another console to manage these devices. In fact, they'd prefer to have a single console to manage all of their devices. And in fact, they'd even prefer that their mobile management solution not be device-centric, but really be user-centric. And so I'd really recommend that you ask some really tough questions to Jim and to myself as well with regard to how mature these technologies are and where organizations are in their maturity assessment. But clearly we're seeing organizations now embracing smartphones. Smartphone adoption within North America and Western Europe is surprisingly limited to approximately 16% of information workers. And these devices have often been limited to select groups of employees that qualify, that really need access to information while on the go. So they're historically provisioned with a corporate liable device. They never really see any of the ongoing voice and data services, but it's very much a one or a two sizes fit all approach. And that's been hugely beneficial to IT managers, but the majority of the growth moving forward is actually going to be through employee-owned devices or some sort of split liability model, and employees are going to have more control over what devices they get provisioned with or what devices they bring in to their work environment. And so we're seeing, obviously, the iPhone sort of introduce this consumer-centric device that bleeds into the enterprise space. And quite frankly, we found a lot of IT managers weren't prepared for that. And that's been extended, obviously, to iOS and specifically the iPad now. And as the screen sizes get bigger among these smart devices, the level of expectations as to what's possible grows exponentially. And with slates and tablets, it's admittedly harder to do in that largely smartphones have been limited to email, contacts, calendar, and very specific lines of business. applications, but it's all about the apps for slates and tablets. And so we're seeing organizations really, struggling to develop mobile applications that span all these devices and platforms and screen sizes, and also be able to seamlessly provision these applications to their increasingly mobile workforce. But the majority of these devices are now bleeding in through the consumer door, and IT managers are now struggling to keep pace with this blazingly hot consumer innovation path that's now having a profound impact on IT strategies. So, high-level, quick overview on some of the key enterprise mobility trends that we're seeing, and we've actually got data to validate. So, first of all, wireless network use is absolutely proliferating. Gone are the days where employees are, locked to a physical desktop. They're physically connected to the network at all times. Employees are increasingly mobile, so when we get the cold or the flu, we don't want to have to come into the work environment and infect the rest of our colleagues. We'd prefer to work from home. A lot of employees work primarily on the road, or if they're not on the road, even within the headquarters or branch office locations, they're meeting with their colleagues and they're taking their laptops, they're taking their smartphones, they're taking their slates and tablets with them. So employees are increasingly productive outside the four walls of the enterprise, or even while mobile within the four walls. They're connecting in from public hotspots and public cellular data networks and cafes and restaurants and airplane lounges, etc. There's also this pent-up demand for mobile devices. So as I sort of subtly mentioned earlier, smartphones historically were limited to less than 20% of information workers here in North America and Western Europe. So obviously that number is going to continue to rise, but arguably the majority of the growth is going to be through personal devices. So personal devices are really increasingly getting support, regardless of whether IT ultimately wants to provide it or strategically outsource it, or try to change the level of expectations with regard to what services IT provides and doesn't provide. But we're definitely seeing software developers now developing applications natively for these devices, and there's a lot of effort with regard to developing these applications and then hosting them and provisioning employees much more efficiently through their mobile device management solution. As a result, we're seeing a lot of IT shops reevaluating the various mobile policies that they support, so what employees get provisioned with what devices, what screen sizes, what form factors, which OSs, and which applications. We're seeing a lot of IT shops also reevaluating their mobile management and data security controls on these devices, because rarely is there a single one-size-fits-all approach that can be applied to 100% of your workforce. In fact, increasingly, we're seeing some shops developing a mobile management and security control over so a baseline level of protection for all of their corporate liable devices, and then a baseline level of protection for all their individually liable devices or personally owned devices. But what we're finding is that some of the more progressive shops are embracing a device-agnostic and increasingly a user-centric mobile device management solution. So I've sort of teed up the high-level picture, but let's get a little bit more dirty and granular. So the platform wars. Historically, BlackBerry had been the dominant platform, and for very good reason. BlackBerry is the gold standard with regard to ongoing manageability and security, with over 500 policies to remotely manage and secure the devices through the BlackBerry Enterprise Server. But we're definitely seeing organizations now realizing that they're facing this overwhelming crush of demand and interest in non-BlackBerry devices, and in the iPhone, in the iPad, in Android-based smartphones, slates and tablets, Windows Mobile, and increasingly Windows Phone 7 devices, not to mention WebOS and maybe even later on down the road, MeeGo. So there's no shortage of devices and OSs that organizations are now folding into their broader enterprise mobility strategy. They're requiring that their mobile device management solution can scale to a number of these various platforms. And what we're finding is that there's never going to be a single winner in the platform wars. At the end of the day, the winner will be you, the consumer, that has the freedom to either be provisioned with a specialized device that's really tailored to your needs, or you with the freedom to bring in your own devices and be productive and be innovative and have the flexibility to choose the device that really fits your profile best, your personality the most. So it's interesting, as we survey IT managers, and when we ask them, where are you in your maturity of, embracing a multi-platform mobility strategy? What we're finding is that, surprisingly, companies are being very progressive about their support of more than just a single platform. In fact, according to our latest data on the topic, and we've actually got the 2011 survey instrument in the field today, but according to our data on the number of platforms, the number of mobile OSs that IT shops officially support and manage, believe it or not, just under, in fact, 49%, so just under half of organizations spanning North America and Western Europe officially support 2 or more mobile platforms. So again, usually that's BlackBerry, and now they're adding support for iOS, or maybe iOS, and now they're considering adding support for Android. But we're definitely seeing organizations now reevaluating their broader enterprise mobility strategy, surveying or engaging their customer base, their employees that they service and support, to gauge their level of interest and demand in these new emerging consumer-centric platforms. And it's also interesting because when we survey IT shops and ask them, okay, so as you're embracing a multi-platform mobility strategy, which platform specifically do you support? Well, again, not surprisingly, BlackBerry is the most widely supported platform. Windows Mobile, there's still a number of legacy devices remaining, but iOS is coming on really strong. iOS was cited by about 1/3 of the organizations that we surveyed. Android was the next sort of consumer-centric platform that's now bleeding into the enterprise space, regardless of whether IT managers have a management solution in place or policies in place to support it. It's happening. It's inevitable. Given the fact that it's an open source platform, given the fact that internal software developers are so excited about porting their applications over to it, and given the fact, the sheer number of device manufacturers and mobile operators that are getting around that platform from Google. So there's a lot of effort in embracing a multi-platform strategy, prioritizing, their relative investments with regard to support for BlackBerry, support for iOS, support for Android, support for smartphones versus support for slates and tablets. But we're definitely seeing organizations also, really struggling with their internal application development strategies. So quite frankly, historically, smartphones had been limited, as I suspect you're seeing on the slide, email, contacts, calendar, personal information management. But increasingly, we're seeing IT shops actually prioritizing their investment around line of business workers, task-oriented workers, where you're developing very specific line of business applications that your task-oriented workers require, so field service applications, Salesforce applications, logistics and warehouse applications, supply chain, for example. And what we're finding is that as we survey IT managers year over year, the actual deployment levels are every single year for the last 2 or 3 years greater than what the same IT shops had predicted just 12 months earlier. So we're seeing organizations now developing a broader set of mobile applications to these devices, and the promise of slates and tablets with the bigger screens, the more collaboration, the more consumption of information is, only going to exponentially continue to grow. And so what does this all mean with regard to consumerization? Well, what we're finding is that, in fact, already the majority of IT shops officially support personally owned devices. But what does support actually mean? We're seeing the majority of shops prefer to limit the scope of what support actually means to their end users, in that they'll selectively embrace, 1 or 2 specific platforms or even versions of a particular platform or device. So for example, we're a BlackBerry shop, but now we're going to have a pilot for the iPhone or for the iPad or for Android as long as it's 2.2 and up. But we're seeing organizations definitely getting much more progressive about piloting these new devices, understanding the use cases, understanding what workers can benefit most before they figure out on the back end who provides the management and security policies, who's managing the console, what people resources we might have in-house to own this moving forward. But definitely the shift with regard to consumerization is in the direction of individually liable devices or some sort of shared responsibility or a hybrid approach. In fact, when we survey information workers directly, circumventing IT, according to our latest data, Q3 of 2010, when we surveyed about 2,000 information workers spanning North America and Western Europe, what we found is that at least in the United States and North America and Canada, already the majority of shops do support individually liable devices or a shared responsibility. So maybe employees are responsible for all of the costs of the hardware, so they can feel free to upgrade to the latest and greatest generation of devices on their own whim, but they're not, completely paying for all of the ongoing voice and data services. So they might be provisioned with a stipend, for example. They might be allowed to expense back anywhere from $50 to $75 for ongoing voice and or data services, but they're charging it back, or some or all of their ongoing voice and data services back to the business. And so we're seeing a lot of IT shops now adding support for individually liable devices, or revisiting this whole stipend model discussion, because there are a lot of IT shops that, quite frankly, have been 100% corporate liable because in a past life they were all about TCO and they felt like this introduced the most efficiency. But as they're adding support for personally owned devices, they want to be sure that they're incenting employees to be more productive. They're not requiring it as a part of their job, but they're definitely interested in offering a stipend to incent employees to want to be more productive. And so what does this all mean? It means that workers are definitely becoming increasingly distributed and mobile. Work is no longer confined to these always connected devices. There's also a pretty significant generational shift in that baby boomers are beginning to retire. These were folks that were simply happy if the technology worked, but they're being replaced by a much younger, more tech-savvy generation of millennials. And these are folks that grew up with smartphones and grew up with slates and tablets and grew up with social networking applications and collaboration. And they just have much loftier expectations of IT with regard to the devices that they're provisioned with regard to the applications that they can be productive on, with regard to their collaborative experience to stay in touch with suppliers, partners, and coworkers and executive managers, and also with regard to whether they're allowed to bring in their own devices or have the freedom to choose a device that fits their personality best. But we're definitely seeing IT shops embracing a multi-platform mobility strategy, and in fact they're embracing a diversity of devices, OSs, applications, and a lot of these devices conflict severely with existing corporate standards and even sourcing practices. So we're seeing IT shops now revisiting their entire mobile strategy. They're feeling this pressure to support personally owned devices and some of the more consumer-centric devices and applications. And as a result, firms are really struggling to keep pace with a twofold challenge. And the twofold challenge is mobile management, mobile device management, and mobile security. So how should firms rethink their mobile strategy, and what are the various mobile device management and security best practices they should look to enforce on these devices, regardless of who actually owns the device? Well, first of all, why are organizations developing or rethinking their broader enterprise mobility policies? Well, at the end of the day, primarily, IT would argue it's all about managing costs. But certainly it's all about introducing new business processes and new efficiencies within the organization. It's designed to reduce risk because there are varying levels of access to sensitive information among your customer base, employee base. We're seeing organizations really segmenting their workforce and developing even user segments based on level of mobility of employees, based on the application stack, and increasingly even based on the level of access to sensitive information on these mobile devices. But it's a very muddled technology landscape, and so we're seeing organizations trying to define this very clear technical roadmap, in this world where change is the one constant. And so, I'd argue that most mobile policies, some of the more successful mobile policies, at the very least, have three key elements. And I'll walk through these three key elements over the course of the next couple of slides. But the first up is a mobility framework. So the mobility framework I think of as the mental checklist that IT managers need to sort of sort through and ask themselves. So what types of employees are we going to focus our projects around? So is it internal employees so that they can be more productive or so that we can lower costs? Is it external customers that we're looking to now engage via their mobile devices? What devices are we looking to prioritize around? Is it iOS? Is it Android? Is it BlackBerry? Is it smartphones? Is it slate tablets? Is it PCs? Is it Windows-based devices? Which OSs? Is it a desktop OS like Windows, or is it a mobile OS like BlackBerry or QNX variant moving forward, or is it Windows Mobile, Windows Phone 7, iOS, or Android, or any others? Which applications? Are we focused on simply email, contacts, and calendar? Are we focusing on a very specific line of business application? Are we focused on unified communications? How much security is appropriate? And rarely is there a rigid answer to that across all your employees. In fact, we're seeing a lot of IT shops revisiting their security policies based on the level of access to sensitive information for their employees. Ultimately, how does IT manage it all? And arguably the most important question is who's paying the bills? The security policy, that's arguably the second key element that goes into most successful mobile policies. So most shops that we engage with are revisiting their baseline level of protection, and usually that starts with a strong password policy. So for example, a 4 or 6-digit device PIN, perhaps auto lock after 15 or 30 minutes of non-use. Perhaps that's even auto wipe after anywhere from 6 to 10 unsuccessful authentication attempts. There's also training aspects. So what happens in the event that the device is lost or stolen? Employees need to understand that these mobile devices inherently introduce risk to the business, and so in the event of lost or stolen devices, they need to immediately notify IT so that IT can send that remote lock and wipe capability or command over the air. But increasingly, we're even seeing some progressive IT shops actually embracing more advanced security methods that adapt to shifts in malware. So for example, we've heard pretty consistently the need to enforce encryption on these mobile devices, because if I'm a bad guy, one of the very first things I'm going to do when I discover a lost or left behind device in a taxi is I'm going to pull the SIM card. And so increasingly we're seeing IT shops actually requiring full disk encryption on their mobile devices. That's just one example. And then arguably the third key element is mobile device management and support. So again, it sets a technical policy based on business input. This isn't just IT locking themselves in a room and coming up with the most cost-effective and easiest to manage environment that they can dream of. This is a very collaborative effort, and not just within IT, spanning a number of traditionally siloed roles within IT. So for example, messaging, collaboration teams, security and risk, infrastructure and operations, the help or service desk, application development. But this requires a lot of input from the business directly. You need to be able to engage with C-level executive managers and line of business managers and even some of the most vocal critics of IT, so you have this input in mind so that you better understand what devices they're requesting access to, what applications they really need to be provisioned with moving forward in order to be more productive, and what level of service and support they need to provide to your segmented workforce. You need a process for introducing new devices and new mobile applications to devices that are already resident within the organization today. You need a process for how devices should be managed, and of course you need a procurement and servicing procedure. But in the interest of time, I want to probably pick up the pace here and leave you with some of the, well, in fact, 20 of the top mobile device management and security best practices that we've been able to pull together through an exhaustive set of research interviews before I leave you with some short and long-term recommendations with regard to what it'll take to build an effective mobile device management strategy. So the first step, I'd argue, and I'm not going to exhaustively go through each of these. Everybody's going to get a copy of the presentation. Of course, we're going to save some time for Q&A, so I look forward to any questions that come in. But I'd recommend as a first step to do a better job of understanding the types of workers, the user segments, the personas of employees that you support today. You know, what their device preferences are, what their application preferences are, what their level of mobility and risk is, and understanding how their technology preferences are evolving as well, because that's the nature of the business. But definitely building in flexibility by enabling device diversity, and arguably the most crucial step is invest in a very mature mobile device management solution that can scale to all the devices that either you support today or are looking to support in the near future. And in a preferable world, obviously, you want to avoid all the back-end infrastructure that's necessary, all the time that's necessary to invest in some of the on-premise behind the firewall management solutions. And for a lot of shops, you know, that don't necessarily have the internal skills or people resources, you could even consider strategically outsourcing it to a partner. But making sure that the mobile device management solution has a web-based console, you know, for all your management and security operations, so there's a single pane of glass. You know, make sure you're spelling out all the appropriate requests forms for obtaining mobile devices, apps, and services. You're spelling out appropriate usage. So as you're onboarding employees, a lot of these policies are apparent to the contract that they sign with the company on day one. But certainly making sure that you're planning support for personal devices and making sure you're not limiting the scope to PCs, you're not limiting the scope to smartphones or even slates and tablets exclusively, but you have all these devices in mind as you reevaluate your mobile management strategy. But certainly, you know, avoid the company logo on your mobile devices because that's only going to want to incentivize some of the bad people that are out there. But we definitely recommend starting with a strong password policy. So that could be a 4 or 6-digit device PIN. You know, depending on which specific industry we're talking about, there might be more tighter restrictions. So for example, in finance and insurance and healthcare and federal, state, and local government agencies, you're probably supporting, you know, a stricter password policy versus those in, I don't know, say manufacturing or transportation industries. But certainly strong password policy, auto wiping the devices after anywhere from 6 to 10 unsuccessful authentication attempts, auto locking the devices after 15 or 30 minutes of non-use, preferably encrypting all the corporate data and sandboxing the corporate data so you're leaving the personal data largely untouched. Making sure you're not overlooking training, and embrace Web 2.0 applications as a means to reinforce best practices. So as you look to pilot the iPad, for example, you know, create a moderated discussion forum, you know, include select users within your pilot, point them all toward the moderated discussion forum so that if they have any questions or technical issues that arose, they could, you know, reach out to their colleagues and their peers within the company that are a part of the pilot. There are some tech-savvy individuals within the organization that I'm sure are more than happy to, in fact, even have the time to, you know, encourage employees and help them overcome issues that they've probably already experienced. But at the same time, trying to change the mindset within your empowered employees that, you know, now they can embrace self-service and self-provisioning to lower support costs, and you're not overwhelming the internal service desk with help desk requests on day one or the first week or two. And certainly leveraging remote control functionality so that in the event, you know, a downtime issue or a misconfiguration issue comes up, IT has the capability to remotely log into the device, see what the user is seeing so you can troubleshoot these issues as they come in more effectively. But we're short on time. I'm going to keep this brief. Before I hand it back over to Jim, I want to touch upon some of the short and long-term recommendations. Okay, so over the next 90 days, we'd really recommend that all clients embrace the idea of consumerization. Do a better job around segmenting your workforce and not just focusing exclusively on mobile devices, but making sure you're thinking about the bigger picture with regard to how devices are introduced, how applications are introduced, and level of management and security control IT is looking to enforce on these devices. But certainly define, or for a lot of firms, redefine what goes into the mobile policy. And oftentimes actually writing a living, breathing mobile policy document that you require your users to read through, understand, and actually sign their names against before they have access to sensitive corporate, secure information. Develop a process for introducing new devices and new mobile applications so that you can provision devices are already in the field over the air, and it's not a manual process for IT to introduce and to manage. But over the longer term, we would absolutely recommend organizations invest in a robust mobile device management solution that doesn't lock you into a single device or platform or limit the number of devices that employees can embrace. Certainly building in flexibility into your broader enterprise mobility strategy by enabling this device diversity. And over time, definitely plan to support employee-owned mobile devices, because arguably that's where the majority of the growth will be moving forward as smartphones and slates and tablets now proliferate well past the 16 to 20% mark. In fact, moving forward, we'll inevitably reach probably closer to 70, 80, 90% over the course of the next couple of years. So with that, I thank everyone very much and look forward to any questions that come in through the WebEx. But before we get to the Q&A session, I want to hand it back over to Jim Safransky from FiberLink to close it out.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Don't go far. There's a lot of questions, and they're good. So, and those best practices we find very actionable, and I suspect the listeners will download that after the webinar. What I like to do here for about 2 minutes is just give the listeners a quick understanding of FiberLink and our product, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. Q&A spans things around bring your own devices, managed services, consolidation, application costs. There's a lot of good questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can, and then we'll do some follow-up on the ones that we can't. But so regarding FiberLink, for those of you that are familiar with us or not, we've been around for almost 20 years now, really focused on enterprise mobility management, and we pretty much live and breathe it. We have hundreds of businesses managing millions of devices using our platform. Our platform is an on-demand device network management service platform. So we provide one single console that you can manage smartphones, the best practices Ben talked about today, and tablets, and where our business got started. And so we have a consolidated platform is the ability to manage PCs, Macs, even data cards and USB drives, all in the same place. And so we really think of mobility as cross-device, and then a cycle from provisioning all the way through to securing and reporting, and then some of the support things. We do this in a on-demand SaaS fashion. So anyone on this webinar today that would like to try it out, you can click on a link that you'll be shown whenever this webinar ends, and you'll be able to just try out the service for free, no strings attached, for 30 days, and it'll take you less than 5 minutes to be up and running, actually. So give it a try if consolidated management of your devices is important to you. And then to learn more just in general, we have a community where this is where the link that we'll email out to you will have the slides, but lots of free tools and forums and technical content in our Master Center community for folks also that want to see kind of upcoming webinars that we host like this. So again, if you want the slides, they'll be emailed to you, and anyone, we would encourage you to check out the product. If you'd like to try a free evaluation, you'll see that when the webinar ends. And with that, let's jump into some of the Q&A. Ben, what I'll do is I'll moderate this. I'll throw some of these to you that have been coming up, and I'll start with a real simple one. There was a question about what did you mean by pervasive video?
So video is coming up more and more in our enterprise inquiries that IT managers are looking to better understand. And the reason is because employees are now accessing a number of various, not just video, but even audio formats. So for example, as part of training exercises, they're consuming and getting trained on via video. On their mobile devices, they can now access streaming video because these devices are smarter and more capable with regard to the video standards that they support. So it's through a combination of training, it's through a combination of even collaboration. So for example, telepresence via their mobile devices and being able to stream webinars via their mobile devices, is increasingly available today. And it's increasingly available via these mobile devices. And so making sure that IT managers are optimizing streaming traffic to their mobile devices and making sure that, IT can selectively embrace it where appropriate, where, for example, in an R&D lab, they might want to actually disable camera capabilities. That's the sort of, scenario in which we're seeing a lot of IT shops asking questions about.
Okay, and next question. We'll ease into the depth of the question. Next, there was a lot of questions around bring your own device models. Are you expensing the phones or just expensing the monthly accounts? I think you covered some of that. But then also about just how do you set up appropriate use and get people to agree to it? So maybe Ben, I don't know if there were examples of a best practice for what is a corporate policy for acceptable use, and how are people agreeing to that as part of employment, or when they try to enroll their personal phone? Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I've got a ton. In fact, we could probably spend a whole day talking about all of that. But at the end of the day, with regard to the shift between corporate liable to individually liable or some sort of hybrid approach, it's admittedly relatively nascent in that approximately 84% of North American and Western European enterprises still support a corporate liable approach. But as you probably saw in some of the data, as you survey information workers directly, regardless of whether IT has any visibility into it or not, in fact, a large percentage of employees are now free to expense back work activities. And so that could be the purchase of new hardware, or more often than not, that could be work calls via their personal devices, personal smartphones, or consuming of mobile data via their personally owned slates and tablets. So what does it all mean? I guess it means that there's no silver bullet single approach for all your workers, and the reason that smartphones and to a certain extent slates and tablets, although it's still an emerging area, have been limited to these just 16% of information workers is they're coming through the IT door, pre-approved to employees that qualify, but arguably the majority of the growth, the other 80% of the workforce that feels largely underserved, are going to want the freedom to bring in their own devices. And some IT managers might afford or provide employees a stipend to expense back some or all of their ongoing voice and data services. And so it all goes back to segmenting the workforce. Because there's no single approach that you can apply to all users, we're seeing organizations segmenting their workforce, even conducting surveys or customer advisory councils or even focus groups to determine, usually a three-tier approach where it's the VIP users, executive managers that sort of qualify for a corporate liable device. They really need it for the purposes of their job so that they can consume information while on the go and make more informed decisions and make decisions quicker. And so these are limited to corporate liable devices, and historically it's been a BlackBerry world, but increasingly they might have the freedom to choose an iOS or an Android-based device. It's tier 2, which is where typically we see employee-owned devices being introduced. So it's the employees that are mobile, a certain percentage of their time. Usually that's 30% or more of their time. These are the employees that would love to have the freedom to bring in their own device and would love to have the freedom to connect into some amount of corporate resources via their personally owned device. And so usually that's limited to email contacts and calendar, but moving forward, it's going to be about line of business applications. And so these are the employees that might qualify for a stipend, and depending on the level of mobility and depending on the title within the organization, they may be allowed to expense back anywhere from as little as $15 to $30 or $50 for ongoing voice, or perhaps even ongoing voice and data. The types of administrative professionals, so finance department or HR department or legal department, that could benefit from clearing their inbox on Sunday night, so when they come in on Monday morning, they actually be productive. These are the types of employees that might actually qualify for anywhere from $50 to $75 on a monthly basis, versus more mobile employees like sales and IT and field service might qualify for as much as $75 to $150. But we're seeing organizations, this is a long answer, we're seeing organizations bake this all into a living, breathing mobile policy document that fleshes out all the rules and regulations of not just corporate devices, but also employee-owned devices, fleshing out a stipend and whether that's available to you as an employee or not, and what that actually looks like. And they're requiring employees to actually read through, understand, and agree to. So they actually require their manager's approval because it will have chargeback implications. But then once they sign their name, they're free to bring in their own device and connect to a certain amount of corporate resources. But more often than not, they're agreeing to certain restrictions. So for example, they're agreeing that this device inherently introduces risk to the business. We agree to and will enforce actively all the various policies that we historically had enforced on our PCs. So strong password policy, remote lock and wipe. In the event of lost or stolen devices, we immediately notify IT. IT reserves a right to remotely wipe that device as necessary. More often than not, employees are then taking on the added responsibility of backing up their own data, so that IT is not held liable for that potential data loss. But they're baking this all into their mobile policy so that, from a technology standpoint, they've got a very robust mobile device management solution to enforce all the technical policies that they're able to. But if there are any gaps in the technology, they're falling back on the living, breathing policy document that they're requiring that their users read through and sign off before they're actually getting connected to corporate resources.
Great, yeah, and we've seen that three-tier approach, and some level of self-service is a good way to get started with the bring your own device. Couple questions, Ben. I guess we still have most people are still on the call, so let's see, Ben, if you and I can get through 3 more questions here real fast, and then
Sure.
everyone get on. A couple questions came in on folks that have existing, I guess what you'd call desktop management solutions in place for PC management, and they're wondering kind of what the best practice is or the trend around getting a separate MDM platform, or if the desktop tools evolved to a place where they can handle your best practices.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a boat that we actually find the majority of our IT clients in that they've got a relatively expensive investment in their existing PC or endpoint lifecycle management solutions. But these solutions were architected with PCs in mind, and specifically with Wintel in mind. And so a lot of organizations are unfortunately coming to the grim realization that their desktop management solutions can't scale to these smartphones and slates and tablets. And if they can, they're very restricted to a particular platform. They often can't scale to individually liable devices, which is why we're seeing organizations now prioritizing their investment in mobile device management. And they, in a perfect world, they'd love to be able to manage all of their mobile devices, all of their PCs, all of their smartphones, all of their slates and tablets through a single pane of glass. And also in a perfect world, they'd prefer to actually avoid the costs of, an on-premise solution that requires back-end infrastructure, that requires ongoing maintenance, that requires, internal people resources to manage, a lot of the associated overhead. And quite frankly, a lot of the established solutions are, pretty expensive, which is why we're seeing a lot of organizations now, considering the full gamut of mobile device management solutions, so on-premise solutions versus cloud-hosted solutions versus even, the strategically outsource this to a managed services provider. But it's been interesting that sort of the tone of the conversations are definitely shifting in the direction of cloud-hosted offerings, as we're seeing IT shops realize that they need a solution in place yesterday, not tomorrow. For a lot of shops, they don't necessarily have the internal skills, up and running that, are really super smart on latest and greatest iOS security threats or Android security threats or, people resources associated with supporting this broad spectrum of devices. But they're looking for a holistic mobile device management solution that doesn't require much overhead, and in fact could potentially even be folded into their BES administrative, people resources that they already support today. So it's been interesting. The tone of the conversation is definitely shifting in the direction of we need to evaluate and pilot and ultimately invest in a mobile device management solution. We'd prefer a cloud-hosted solution because that's obviously a lot quicker and simpler to get up and running, and it's a more predictable cost basis too. And so it's been interesting to see the level of tone and the relative priorities, but definitely seeing mobile device management as a top priority for not just IT managers and chief information security officers, but also even line of business managers that have very significant influence in their next generation mobile strategies.
Okay, we had a lot of questions around managed services and how do you understand if a platform is ready beyond safe harbor, or what kind of certifications are out there. Given that's a world that we've lived in with a hosted, a cloud-based solution, we'll publish some information out on that one. Ben, in 1 minute or less, Android, are you seeing it now in 2011 April as a business class product, and what's the trick to making it that? And we'll end on that one.
Yeah, so great question. A minute or left will be tough, but at the end of the day, yes, Android is bleeding into the enterprise space. It's that sort of next consumer phenomenon that's going to have a profound impact on IT internal strategies. We're seeing a lot of shops be relatively hesitant about embracing it until it supports some of the more enterprise class mobile device management capabilities, but the MDM vendors, including FiberLink, are working very closely with the broader ecosystem to scale that functionality. So, for example, enforcing all the active sync policies on Android devices. So, for example, that baseline level of protection with regard to strong password policy, 4 or 6-digit device PIN, auto lock, auto wipe, full disk encryption, and increasingly software push. But it'll be interesting to see what the Android numbers are according to our latest data. I'd venture a guess that it was in, around 20% about a year ago. I'd argue that north of 50% of North American and Western European organizations are already piloting it. The scale of the deployment is arguably probably limited. I'd argue that most organizations are scaling their deployments over the course of the next couple of years, but arguably starting with a relatively small pilot of anywhere between 25 and 50 devices before they look to scale it to 250 to 500 to 1,000 to 5,000 to 20,000. So the maturity assessment is arguably going to take many years, and will continue to ramp as some of the more heavily regulated industries look to validate some of these more consumer-centric platforms. But Android, iOS, and BlackBerry, and arguably even moving forward, Windows Phone 7 are sort of the 4 major mobile OSs that we're seeing IT managers look to develop a mobile strategy around, and look to enforce mobile management policies and controls via their mobile device management investment.
Great. Yeah, we'll look forward to those numbers on the increase. We're seeing a ton of Android in addition to iOS, obviously, and there were questions and comments from participants that they're even moving aggressively away from BES and off just to embrace those platforms. So, well, Ben, tip of the iceberg, but I think extremely powerful and relevant information for everybody, so I wanted to thank you.
Great.
And we'll as I've said a couple of times, these slides are available to you, and we'll follow up. There was a lot of Q&A we didn't get to. We'll make sure we have a chance to publish those out to folks and offer FiberLink and Ben's responses. So thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's presentation. We would like to thank you once again for your time today, and you may now disconnect.